The day after the election in November 2016, the morning after the election, we know from Robert Mueller's report that somebody whose name is redacted sent a text containing this phrase, the phrase, quote, "Putin has won." That phrase was texted to a Russian businessman, to the head of a Russian sovereign wealth fund, a guy by the name of Kirill Dmitriev. Soon after Kirill Dmitriev received that message about the U.S. election result, Putin has won, that same businessman, the guy who's the head of the Russian sovereign wealth fund, this Kremlin-connected, sort of Kremlin emissary business guy, he responds to that Putin has won text by turning around and texting somebody else. He texts a guy named George Nader to say, hey, I want to meet all the key people in the incoming Trump administration, given the great result. Quote, later that morning, Dmitriev contacted Nader, who was in New York, to request a meeting with the, quote, key people in the incoming administration as soon as possible, in light of the, quote, great results. So here's a guy who's working for the Kremlin, running a Kremlin-backed Russian sovereign wealth fund. He gets this message, Putin has won. That's the response to Trump winning the election. He is super psyched that Trump won the election. Right after receiving the Putin has won text, he turns around that same morning, and thereafter he decides he needs to be connected to the key people in Trump's world, ASAP. Who does he call to make those connections, to introduce him to all the key Trump people? He calls a guy named George Nader. George Nader is the guy who was just arrested today on child pornography charges as he landed at JFK Airport. That's one of the threads involving George Nader that's described in the Mueller report and in open source reporting. His arrest today is in keeping with his previous criminal record, but given what else is going on in terms of the Mueller investigation and the Russia scandal, the news of his arrest today at JFK Airport was a shock. The Washington Post reporter who broke that story today is Devlin Barrett. He joins us now. Mr. Barrett, it's great to have you back with us tonight. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
So you and your colleague, Rachel Weiner, were first on this story today. Do you have any understanding of whether or not Mr. Nader knew that traveling back to the U.S. today would result in him being arrested?
It's pretty clear that from everything that's happened in the last 24 hours that he did not know this was coming. This wasn't some sort of arranged surrender or, negotiated deal between Nader and the government, because what happens is he's arrested at the airport, and then they proceed to have a bail hearing in which he very clearly is trying hard to come up with some conditions to get released on bond. And so far that hasn't happened, but there's going to be another hearing tomorrow. But my point is, if there had been some arrangement or some expectation that this could be even possible, it wouldn't have gone down like this. It would have gone down in a much different way.
So there's been previous reporting that obviously Mr. Nader was a cooperating witness with the Mueller investigation. He is described, including his multiple discussions with the special counsel's office and FBI agents, are described and footnoted throughout Volume 1 of the Mueller report. There's been a lot of reporting that he cooperated with the government, with those prosecutors, with some sort of immunity deal, with at least a limited immunity deal. Does our understanding of that previous reporting change at all now that he's been arrested?
I don't think it changes a lot, but there's still some gaps that we haven't been able to fill in. But basically, I think the simplest answer is he cooperated under some sort of proffer terms, and we're told gave testimony to the grand jury. And technically, and basically, most of the time when you have a proffer, what you're talking about is you agree to tell your story to prosecutors with the understanding that you'll only be charged if you are caught lying to them. And so that is the basic premise of most proffer sessions. And so at that point, we have every reason to believe that was sort of the general condition of the Nader conversation, although we'd certainly like to know more and get the particulars of this. But my point is, it's entirely possible, and what it looks like so far is that Nader had some sort of understanding with prosecutors to talk about things like the meeting in the Seychelles, but not necessarily in a way that would expose him to any sort of criminal charges unless he lied to them.
So forgive me for being dense on this stuff. And in part, I'm distracted because Nader is part of so many different plots and so many different storylines here, not many of which we feel like we've gotten to the end about. But is it possible that Nader would have done the type of immunity deal where he was not going to be prosecuted, where they agreed to not prosecute him for any of the things that he was describing to them related to the subject of their investigation. But this child pornography stuff was totally outside the realm of what they were talking to him about. They obviously had evidence of this from their first contact with him in January of 2018. Is it possible that he would have done a cooperation deal with this stuff carved out, knowing that he was still liable to be prosecuted on this stuff?
It's a great question. I think the parts we can answer are this. It basically appears that by February so Nader arrives, let's back up. Nader arrives in the United States January of 2017. I'm sorry, January 2018. He is questioned by FBI agents working for Bob Mueller's team. In February, the following month, those agents realize that one of the phones they've seized has this child pornography video on it, allegedly, several videos, according to the criminal complaint. So in February of that year, they have some sense that there's a problem here that goes way beyond just the Mueller issues. But they don't have a full chargeable case on him until April. And what seems to have happened is he seems to have left the country by April. And now, because he came back, apparently thinking, as best we can tell, that he was no longer in danger, then he gets charged.
Okay, so he did his cooperation. He testified to maybe the grand jury, certainly talked to Mueller's investigators between the time that he was initially picked up in January and when they brought that criminal case against him in April. So he may have thought that enough time had passed that he was out of the woods. Let me just ask you one other piece of this, Devlin. Obviously, part of the intrigue about Mr. Nader is that he appears to have been a little bit of a go-between for some Kremlin-connected figures like Kirill Dmitriev and the Trump campaign. He also directly appears to have been working on behalf of United Arab Emirates and the Saudi government in terms of some other kinds of overtures they were making to the Trump campaign and later to the Trump administration. Do you have any understanding from your reporting as to what happened to Mueller's inquiries related to the Emirates and Saudi Arabia and whether or not they may have also been involved in any sort of improper foreign interference?
Well, they certainly looked at this, and what you see from the report is the investigators are really focused on the Seychelles meeting and the Russian official Dmitriev and how that played into it. But obviously that's probably not Nader's main focus, considering who he works for and where he lives. But I think what's interesting about that whole sequence of events is what seems to happen, according to the investigators, is that at some point that meeting in the Seychelles happens, and then after that meeting, basically the meeting doesn't go well. It's an attempt to establish a back channel, as far as we can tell, that just falls apart because the Russian official, Dmitriev, doesn't seem to very much like Erik Prince and doesn't seem to trust him as a good go-between, and it all sort of falls apart from there. So the relationship seems to go sour and go south pretty quickly after that.
Devlin Barrett, national security reporter at The Washington Post. Thank you for helping us understand this, and congratulations on the scoop today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, much more to get to tonight. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.